Good afternoon. My name is Bruce Smith. I work at the Goosmann Law Firm in Sioux City, Iowa, and I'll be presenting an approximate 30-minute discussion about process safety management and trying as best as possible to focus on the management of change aspect of that compliance program. We, as a law firm, do engage in the practice of law, of course, and we provide legal advice and opinions, but the information I am providing you should not consider as legal advice to a client, and you should engage your own legal counsel to analyze your particular concerns and situation regarding this or any other subject. The Process Safety Management Program, for those who are not familiar with it, is an OSHA program as well as an EPA one that I will briefly mention, dealing with hazardous chemicals and how to properly manage the hazardous chemical process at your facility. I list the 14 elements of the program in addition to management of change because process safety management of hazardous chemicals at a facility is an interrelated regulatory process, starting with process safety information all the way through to emergency planning and response. And when I start to discuss management of change, it will be impacted by all these other particular programs in one form or another. So in order to properly comply with process safety management, you have to, as a facility, make sure you are in compliance with all other elements of the program listed. Basically, I give you a pictorial of how these elements are again repeated by name, but again, the purpose of the program is to protect employees from the hazards of hazardous chemical releases and exposures in the workplace, and to minimize the likelihood that such releases would occur during the course of a facility's operations. The elements mentioned are truly interlinked, and you would find that if OSHA or EPA ever investigate your facility for PSM compliance, they will not only be looking at management of change, but other key aspects of compliance named as all those other elements. So it is a rather comprehensive and somewhat difficult standard to comply with. The major objective of process safety management, if you do not already know, is to regulate the hazardous chemicals so as to prevent unwanted releases in the workplace. It truly is a systematic approach that a facility must follow as it goes through its attempts to comply with process safety management. And I list some of the major focus points dealing with design and process technology, process changes once a system is in place, operational and maintenance activities and procedures, non-routine activities and procedures, emergency preparedness and training programs for employees and operators, all of which have to come into play and be integrated in order to have an effective process safety management program. Now, my experience at this level has been to, excuse me, my screen has frozen. My experience has been in the ammonia anhydrous ammonia field, dealing not only with cold storage, but ambient air manufacturing controls for temperatures, and also the application of ammonia to food processing systems inside manufacturing facilities. These particular aspects of PSM are triggered by the nature of your hazardous chemical, in which case my experience again has been with anhydrous ammonia. And you'll excuse me for just one brief moment. Okay, the application lines of defense that have been incorporated into design and operation of the process to prevent and mitigate releases of hazardous chemicals. The PSM standards are targeted toward hazardous chemicals that really have the potential to create catastrophic releases and events resulting in serious injury and death to employees. And you have not only the OSHA process safety management regulations that a facility must be concerned with, but also separate mirror image regulations to some extent imposed by the EPA called risk management. And employers who are deemed in violation of OSHA PSM standards will likely also be in violation of EPA risk management plan regulations and subject to dual fines and penalties for such violations. So the magnitude of a non-compliant act by a facility can be, in essence, doubled, and with EPA, fines and penalties can far exceed that which OSHA may apply in the event of a non-compliant regulatory situation. Therefore, it's important to recognize the existence of both the OSHA and EPA programs that in many respects do mirror image each other. There are differences with the EPA from OSHA, but likely that if you're violating an OSHA PSM standard, you're probably violating an EPA standard as well. The hazards of the chemicals used in the process is an important aspect as one of the elements, and I won't dig deep into all of these other aspects outside of management of change, but you need to be generally aware of those other elements in addition to management of change. You have to have on-site in writing as well as training of the hazards of the chemicals used in your manufacturing process. And the safety data sheet information is one aspect of how a facility will help meet those requirements for information and knowledge about the hazardous chemicals employees must know about. But it is supplemented with a whole bunch of other process chemistry information, including runaway reaction and overpressure hazards that should be occurring. You also have the technology of the process that has to be written up and understood, dealing with safety information, limits beyond which you're prohibited from operating equipment, consequences of the results of deviating from the operating parameters of your system. And of course, the government really requires diagrams to help people who operate the system to understand the process. You will oftentimes find that you need a block flow diagram to show the major process equipment and interconnecting process flows. And process flow diagrams really are more complex than perhaps what I'm about to show you. But as you can see, you need to have a general written, can be paper as well as computerized access to the system in its summary fashion on a flow diagram basis. And if you don't have such a diagram basis set out in your PSN program, you are in violation. Now, the piping and instrument diagrams, which engineering industry calls those PNIDs, are diagrams that show the details as well as information regarding the piping, the line design that exists in a facility. This is a much more detailed type of diagramming that has to be done as part of the process safety management program. Without that, you are in violation. And one of the key problems with PNIDs is that as changes are made to systems, the facility has to update those PNIDs. And so there are computer programs and so forth that are available for facilities to use when they are in fact creating or updating PNIDs. But the updating process is very tedious and requires an engineering grade draftsman type of expertise in order to do that. But they must be up to date, current, and available for employees to review and use as part of the process safety management system. The information pertaining to process equipment design must be documented. And what does that mean? Well, the codes and standards are relied on to establish good engineering practice. So you have national societies that create and publish standards and codes of minimum acceptability that must exist with equipment and systems. It could be ASME or the American Petroleum Institute, National Standards Institute, which is NC, National Fire Protection Association, and other organizations that all provide suggested regulatory code compliance requirements that OSHA and EPA look to as needing to be followed by facilities when they are designing and installing and using operating equipment of one form or another in a closed system that has a hazardous chemical. For the existing equipment design and construction that occurred many years ago, you need to come up with the relevant information that you can show OSHA that at the time of the construction and implementation of those older systems, they were in compliance. The Clean Air Act says that employers are to heavily involve their employees in the process of risk management as well as OSHA's requirement to comply with PSN. It isn't enough just to supposedly train employees and educate them. You actually have to receive input from employees who will be working with those systems in order to make sure that your training is adequate. And at times, based on the level of employee expertise, they could be maintenance people as well as engineers. They need to be involved in the actual management and change process that we will be discussing here shortly. Employers who don't have verifiable employee participation, which means sign-offs, so that you can verify that employees have been involved in the program, is a violation of OSHA PSN standards and EPA law. Now, one important aspect of the PSN program is the process hazard analysis, or it's an evaluation of the most important elements of the process safety management program. It's an organized and systematic effort to identify and analyze the significance of potential hazards associated with processing and handling. And a PHA, process hazard analysis, is supposed to provide information that will assist employers and employees in making decisions for improved safety and reducing the consequences of unplanned catastrophic releases of hazardous chemicals in the workplace. What is a PHA? Well, it's an analysis of the potential causes and consequences that can lead to explosions and releases of hazardous chemicals. And it basically focuses on the type of equipment involved, instrumentation, human actions, whether they're routine or anticipated but not routine, and other external factors. Now, the operating procedures are equally important, because if you don't have written operating procedures for the system involved in the equipment and employees trained on those operating procedures, you are in violation of PSM. There's a lot of technical compliance verification you have to ensure occurs when you're making up these procedures. They have to be reviewed by competent, knowledgeable personnel within the facility or by outside contractors. And this is all done to help make sure that, it's one thing to have a system in place, it's another thing to operate it safely. So operating procedures that employees are trained on that are accurate and sufficient must exist, or else you will be in violation of PSM. Obviously, you're going to have engineering type of involvement in this process, whether it's outside contractor engineering or in-house engineering. And furthermore, you have to go through and annually certify that the previous year's operating procedures are in fact accurate. Now, if there are modifications to the system, the management and change process, those operating procedures will have to be changed in writing, and the employees trained on those changes. So part of it is self-executing if in fact you're following the management change procedures. Now, operating procedures have to and should include applicable safety precautions and appropriate information about safety. For instance, the operating procedures addressing operating parameters will contain instructions about pressure limits, temperature ranges, flow rates, what do you do when an upset condition occurs, alarms, and so forth that will kick into effect. All of that has to be part of the operating procedures. I mentioned before the significance of employee training, and that is applicable for both EPA as well as OSHA compliance. You cannot have a hazardous chemical system in operation in place in the facility without employee training about the chemicals and how to operate the systems for those that are engaged in that aspect of involvement with a hazardous chemical system. It is fairly common for OSHA, when they come in to do an inspection or to investigate an incident, to really focus on employee training because they consider that to be one of the essential compliance regulations that facilities have to make sure occurs with their workforce. An ignorant workforce is not something you want when you're dealing with hazardous chemicals, and OSHA makes that one of their higher priorities, employee training. This is especially true, I think, when you're talking about maintenance employees who are working on the systems when they're down, fixing them, and then bringing them back up. Perhaps more so than people who are simply working around the hazardous chemicals but not operating the systems. You can have a manufacturing process where certain employees don't ever operate the hazardous chemical system, and the training is when there is a release occurring, they are to immediately leave the affected area or even the facility itself and let others tend to the issue who are trained in emergency response. Now, many employers do hire outside contractors to perform work on hazardous chemical systems rather than paying the money to have their own employees qualified to do that type of work. For instance, needing to weld and change piping flows and diagrams, that you are not going to have in-house welders available to do that kind of work. So for contractors whose safety performance on the job is not known, is hired by the employer must obtain information on injury and illness rates and experience when deciding who to hire as a contractor. I would also add that if you hire outside contractors who are trained and allegedly qualified to work on your hazardous chemical systems, their accident and injuries in your facility actually have to be tracked by you. They're an independent employer. They have their own people hired, and they keep their own injury and illness logs. But you, as the owner of the facility, having hired the contractor, also have to keep track of accidents and injuries in the workplace, even though you are not the contract employee's employer. That's part of the PSM RMP requirements under the law. And OSHA actually will ask for that type of log information by the owner of the facility concerning contractor employee injuries and accidents. One important aspect of hiring an outside contractor is that you have to make sure the contractor is qualified to work on a hazardous chemical system. You also have what's known as pre-startup safety review, which is for new processes. You have to go through a process hazard analysis and make sure that everything is ready to go before you even attempt to start up a modified system or a new system that involves hazardous chemicals. And that means completing all P&IDs, completing all operating procedures, training the operating staff on how to run the process, all before startup. You have to have initial startup procedures, pre-startup review, which is going through the process of reviewing everything that's taking place prior to actually transferring a hazardous chemical into whatever system it might be. And that includes operating mode education for the employees who will be operating the system. Now, when we get into management of change shortly, if you're just replacing an identical piece of equipment like a valve, there's no change in the kind of valve. It's a replacement in kind type of maintenance work performed. You don't have to go through management of change as a process, but you still have to follow other procedures before you start that system back up. Pre-startup safety review, for instance, still has to be followed for that purpose. Now, mechanical integrity is another important aspect of your program, and you must ensure as an employer that you don't have rusty, malfunctioning type of valves and lines and systems that through age start to wear down, and you have mechanical integrity as an auditing program and one that needs to be adhered to in order to avoid being considered a violation of PSM. It is expensive at times to have to hire outside contractors to come into your facility to perform a mechanical integrity program audit, but it's something that has to be done. And you will have your maintenance procedures and internal testing procedures and training and personnel part of that auditing program. Incident investigation is another aspect. If you do have a release in the facility, you have to perform a formal investigation. If the release was beyond an incidental release and could have led to a major release or a catastrophic release. And OSHA normally will be in your facility if you have had such a catastrophic release occur, and sometimes the EPA. So you have to develop an in-house system in place as to who will constitute a team of people investigating such releases. And it must be in writing and made part of the permanent file of the facility subject to OSHA inspection. You have to be careful as to what's in that report so you avoid as best as possible admissions against your own interests, because the report can be used to cite you if you are mentioning deficiencies uncovered during the course of your internal incident investigation. Now that we get to management of change, probably one of the most important aspects of PSM, I give you the federal regulations, and I'm not going to go through the regs right now, but basically to properly manage changes to process, chemical, technology, equipment, facilities, you must define what is meant by change. In the process of safety management standards, change includes all modifications to equipment, procedures, raw materials, and processing conditions other than replacement in kind. It's a practical matter if you're going to switch out equipment that isn't identical to the existing equipment, or you're going to change the flow diagram process, or increase or decrease this or that aspect of your system. You have to go through a management of change documented process before you can actually perform the change and start up the modified system. It is an aspect that OSHA and EPA look at whenever they audit facilities for PSM or RMP compliance, and you need a file with documentation in it available for the inspectors to look at to prove that you have in fact gone through the aspects of management of change. What it means to properly manage changes to process, chemical, technology, equipment, and facilities. You must define what is meant by change, and that includes modifications to equipment, procedures, raw materials, and processing conditions other than replacement in kind. These changes need to be properly managed before identifying and reviewing them prior to implementation of the change. So you actually have to go through a process which includes engineering, safety, etc., in writing that shows that all aspects of the consequences of the change have been considered before you even start construction for those changes. It's going to involve changing operating procedures, which might mean changing pressure limits, temperatures, flow rates. The operator must have flexibility to maintain safe operation within the established parameters, so you need this aspect of management of change in place before the change occurs. I'd like to fast forward through the fact that where the impact of the change is minor and were understood, a checklist reviewed by an authorized person with proper communication with others who are affected may be sufficient. However, for a major, complex, or significant design change, the process hazard analysis may have to be performed as well. Changes in P&IDs is usually required, and operating procedures, and mechanical integrity, electrical classifications. It's a very complicated process management of change is, but must be followed. And lots of times for the larger changes, you do have to do a process hazard analysis. Let me forward through here on management of change. They give you a form, and this is more of a government form, a notification of process changes. It gives you an idea of some of the points you need to be concerned about and actually sign off to. Now, every facility's forms are different. This is a simplified form, but one that gives you an idea of all the considerations that have to be thought through first before you actually make changes. I give you also an accident investigation report form. This is the National Safety Council version. Those two really need to be reviewed by an attorney working for your facility in order to evaluate what is or isn't necessary. You generally don't want to disclose more than you need to when you do an accident investigation. Other areas involve emergency preparedness, compliance auditing, staffing to comply with PSM and RMP requirements. And then when audits are performed of various kinds under PSM, you really need to react to the evaluations when corrective action is suggested. And with OSHA and with EPA, they want to know that if corrective action was noted in an audit, that that particular action was taken, or that something in place of it was followed to take care of the deficiency or action required. I think you can tell from this particular program, and what I've gone through is just an introduction, that it is complicated. It needs outside expert advice, sometimes from engineers and ESM experts as well as attorneys. Make sure that you are in compliance with the regulations. It can be expensive, it can be complicated, but it is the law. The consequences of not complying with the law, should there be a catastrophic release of a hazardous chemical in your workplace, is not only civil liability, but it can also be criminal liability, especially when there is serious injury or death resulting from the release. So you need to make sure that you are, in fact, consulting the proper support people in order to make sure that you are in compliance. And to fail to do so is running an unnecessary risk that may come to bite you in the behind later on with catastrophic consequences to you as a company. So I appreciate your time and effort and wish you well this day.